It's 7 o'clock, and I say welcome everyone again. Thank you for joining us on our SDS Thursdays. We've decided to name them now, so they'll be called SDS Thursdays. And today we are with Paul Grantham, and we are continuing on the topic of anger, because of all the topics we've offered so far, anger probably generated the vast majority of questions and had a really strong response from you. So what Paul did is he copied all your questions from the chat box, so he will be starting with answering the questions which were asked last time, but obviously feel free to type additional questions you want him to cover, and he will be answering them as well. Also, I don't know if you took that offer, the advantage of that offer or not. We were offering our full recording of 2-day anger course with 50% discount, and I know lots of people took advantage of that offer, and this offer expires on the 4th of July. So on SDS website, you still can purchase that 2-day recording on working with different types of anger with 50% discount, which makes it a good value. So that's all from me, and I'll pass the microphone to Paul and enjoy the presentation.
Thank you very much, Julia. Welcome, folks. I'm glad you come back here again. I think that, I obviously have a great deal of interest in the whole issue of anger. I was quite surprised, I think, by the degree of response in terms of questions to this. Not that I thought it would be a boring topic, but I was quite sort of struck and overwhelmed by the degree of interest, I think. So not surprisingly, in these sort of brief, and they are fairly brief, events that we're actually running here on Thursday evenings, I was actually only able to really tackle a couple of the questions that really came up. So what I've gone and done is I've gone through the chat box and looked at the other questions that really I didn't have a chance to address, and maybe rather optimistically, what I've tried to do is to group them into two particular types, because although there was a range of questions, I felt that broadly speaking, the ones that I didn't address last time came under two particular headings, and that's what I'm going to be sort of looking at now as I go through this with my my presentation to you. But can I just say, this is a huge topic, and it is actually quite a complex one. So as other things cross your mind, if you want to pop them in the chat box, depending on how time goes, I'll try and pick up on those as well. I also have a suspicion that some of the things I'm going to be saying, I guess in connection with previous questions, may well give rise to new questions in themselves. So again, please feel free to actually pop your ideas down in the chat box about that. So there's two areas that I really wanted to focus on. One is the issue of motivation stroke denial. How do you work with folks with anger problems who basically don't think they've got a problem with anger? Or alternatively, they may or may not think they've got a problem with anger, but trying to motivate them to engage or deal with this is actually something which I think is often quite challenging. So I'm going to be spending a short amount of time looking at that. And the other issue, which we didn't really touch on at all last time, could be broadly termed anger suppression. So I think probably in fairness, I looked last time primarily at what might be broadly termed expression problems with anger, plus some sort of generic overarching concerns and issues as well. So I wanted to spend some specific time on looking at anger suppression, partly I think because I think that there's often some misunderstanding about it, and the way in which it's actually approached is again more complicated, I think, in a strange way than some of the issues around with the expression problems. So let's kick off with looking at how the heck do you work with people who basically don't think that they have a problem with anger. They deny it, or alternatively, they may or may not deny it, but basically trying to engage them in getting to grips with it, or working with it, or managing it is very difficult. Their motivation is low. There's two separate issues that are around with this, which I think feed into it as a problem. And they may be both present in a particular client that you're working with, but I think that it's likely that at least one of them is present, even if both of them aren't. So the first point to make, which I think is something that I did briefly mention last time, is that it is extremely common when people feel angry that they believe that they are justified in feeling angry. In other words, the vast majority of anger that people feel, whether it's a problem or it's not a problem, to be honest with you, it could be broadly described as righteous anger. So that immediately creates a motivational issue. Because almost inevitably, people understandably are going to be thinking to themselves, why the hell should it be me that changes? It should be these other people out there that have caused me to be angry that should change. I've been the one that's been treated unfairly. I'm the one that's been hurt. I'm the one that's been stopped. They're the ones that you ought to be working with, not me. So that's one reason. The other issue that comes up, and which overlaps, to be honest with you, with the issue of anger suppression, is that for some people, not all, but for some people, anger is a socially unacceptable emotion. It's one which is seen as socially taboo. It's one which may be seen as personally taboo as well. We'll come on to that later on. It may be something that sits uncomfortably with people's beliefs, either about who they are or who they believe they should be. So in those sorts of circumstances, it's not going to be surprising that trying to engage people can be quite tricky. So where do we start with this? Well, I'm going to say something which I hope is not going to be too controversial, but I think it's a really important in principle to grasp, really. And in a strange way, I think often therapists, particularly with anger problems, are not necessarily terribly good at. And what I want to say is that anger is just a word. That's all it is. It's a word. And it doesn't necessarily have to be treated as if it has any objective reality to it. Now, I mention this because I think a lot of therapists see themselves as in the business of trying to get clients to own their anger, to give voice to their anger, to take responsibility for their anger. And for a whole variety of reasons, which we will look at in more detail in a moment over anger suppression, clients are often quite resistant to do that. Even with anger expression problems, they're often resistant to do it. So what I would personally suggest is that you don't try and pursue this, because you're actually going to end up amplifying the client's resistance. And I would actually argue quite strongly that it's not necessary to do that in order to move the client forward. So I would let the client define the problem themselves. Let the client use their own language to talk about what the problem actually is, even if incidentally that's a problem definition which you yourself don't agree with. And there's lots and lots of examples of this. But let me give you a few things to consider. The first thing is that anger is a very strong word to actually own. So for some people, it's a lot easier to work with them if you use a milder version of the word. So some people are happier to look at the whole question of feeling irritable or annoyed or upset. Or in some instances, they will even describe it as feeling anxious. And I wouldn't push that. If that's the language that people want to use, which is a sort of milder, more socially acceptable language to use, then I'll be quite happy for the client to use that, because it's not, these are just words. And that actually at the end of the day, what's most important for us, and I hope for our clients as well, is that they're able to function in a more successful way, in a way where they are happier and where those around them are actually happy. So don't bang the drum for the word anger. Let the client use their own language for this. And secondly, in some extreme instances, you may have to move away totally from the idea that this is a problem which is internal to the client. And let me give you a couple of very extreme examples of this. I've certainly done work with folks who are perpetrators of domestic violence, where, to be honest with you, I think it's extremely rare for me to ever come across people who say to me, I've got a problem with my anger, please help me. But they do define themselves as having a problem, which is that they will actually say they've got a nagging partner, for instance. Now, I'm quite happy to move along in therapy with the client with that definition, simply because quite clearly the client at this point in time, when I'm seeing them, is finding that they are not managing that problem as they themselves define it in a way which is successful. It's causing them problems in some way. And I hope you can see that this substantially overlaps with working with clients who've been mandated or pressurized to see you, which is often pretty common, to be honest, with a lot of anger problems. So at the end of the day, I'll be much more interested in exploring with that perpetrator, for instance, how things are working out with managing a nagging partner, to which they're going to say, well, it's not working out. And then we can explore an alternative way of actually approaching things. And exactly the same with someone who says, I've not got a problem at all. You know, I've been sent, I don't want to be here, but I don't actually think I've got a problem. To which my natural response would be to say, so if I understand this correctly, you are more than happy to spend the rest of your life seeing me. And they would say, well, obviously not, no. And so I would say, but you've been sent here. And they would say, yeah. And I would say, so what is it that you've got to do to convince people that you don't need to come here anymore? So we define the problem, and I know this will sound slightly strange, but we define the problem from their perspective as having to see me. Now, I know that this whole idea of client problem definition can actually raise a whole series of other questions, and you may want to pop some of those in the chat box. But just to say this briefly, that is the broad route I would go down. I would not be banging the drum and putting a lot of emotional energy into trying to convince the client that their definition of the problem is wrong and that they ought to be adopting my definition or somebody else's definition of the problem. And all of this does, I hope you can see, is it neatly finesses and bypasses the whole issue of denial, really. And it bypasses in many ways the motivational issue. Now, you might be sitting there and saying, you know, people ought to own up to the fact that they're angry. People ought to own up to the way in which they're feeling is an issue, and this is what they're feeling. And I would say to you, well, in an ideal world, they should do. But on the other hand, we're not living in an ideal world. And actually, what's most important is that this particular person functions more successfully, that they're happier, and that the people around them are happier. And if we have to use an alternative language to do that, then so be it. So that's one particular thing I would say. Secondly, maybe this is an obvious point to make, but it struck me from some of the questions that came up last time that maybe I ought to unpackage this in some ways, which is, please do treat the client's experience and their definition of the problem with respect. Now, I phrase it in that particular way because I would want to make a distinction here between agreeing with the client and even going further than that and saying colluding with the client and treating their experience with respect. I noticed in some of the questions that came up last time. There was an issue around about, well, what do you do if the client is angry about something which is justified? And oppression was the obvious example that came up in connection with that. To which my reply would be that what we're really talking about here is the client's perception of threat or injustice coincides with the therapist's. Now, I hope you can see that that almost inevitably means that if it doesn't coincide with your definition and my definition of what is justified anger, we are going to take a more negative view, and we're actually not treating the client's experience or definition with respect. So I would actually argue, I would put to one side the whole question of whether the anger is justified or not. I would treat the experience, whatever it actually is, whatever the cause is, respectfully. But I would be very careful indeed in taking a position where you are expressly saying to the client, yeah, this is right that you should feel angry in this way. I can certainly say I understand why the client feels angry in this particular way, but I would never go further than that. And I think that's an important thing, can I just say, for us to remember as therapists as well, because if you don't remember it as a therapist, you can end up, if you're not careful, feeling as stuck as the client does about this, because you're going to have a voice on your shoulder which says, well, if I was in this particular situation, I would be incredibly angry as well. And what the hell can you do about it? Because this is very justified, what they're feeling angry about. And although at one level that's true, it also, unfortunately, can potentially play into a certain level of stuckness. So try and make a distinction here between treating all clients' experience of anger, however they define it, with respect, and actually agreeing with some of them and others. And this also, I guess, ties into the issue that whatever it is that the person is actually feeling angry about, it is nonetheless causing them a problem. And it's a problem that they wouldn't have. And it's a problem that they would like to get rid of. So even when someone has got angry in response to something which you and I would see justified, that client is there seeing us because that anger in some way, shape or form is creating a problem for them. Now, it may be creating a problem because it makes them very distressed. It may be creating a problem for them because someone else has sent them along. They don't want to be there. But at the end of the day, it is creating a problem for them. And in other words, whether the anger is justified or not, they are having to pay a price for that anger, which they at the very least are feeling ambivalent about having to pay. And yet they're having to pay it. So what I'd be more tempted to do would be, and this is something we're going to come on to now, is I'd be more tempted to identify where the client's ambivalence lies towards their anger. Because I could say to the client who's very angry and is angry for a reason that they see as being very justified, well, why the hell are you here? Or why the hell don't you just have to, why don't you just put up with having to be here if you've been sent? To which the client is basically going to say to me, because I don't want this. I don't want to be paying this price. And I would reflect back that ambivalence, that on the one hand, we've got here an experience, a reaction that the client's actually having, which they feel is justified. But on the other hand, it makes them feel very distressed. It makes them feel very uncomfortable because of the price that they're having to pay for this. There is a quote which I think I might have mentioned last time, which I can't remember if I mentioned this in connection with revenge, which is where the concept came originally from. But to be honest with you, it's applicable across the board to anger, which is that anger can feel like a feast until you realize you're the main course. In other words, you do pay a price for this. So I think that should hopefully give you some ideas to at least stimulate and challenge, I hope, the way that you might approach some of the motivational issues that are actually around there with this. And to be honest with you, there's a variety of ways in which you can approach that, bearing that in mind. For those of you, for instance, with a CBT background, this strikes me as being quite clearly material which can actually be worked with using a Socratic questioning approach. For those of using other modalities as well, there's a clear role here for motivational interviewing strategies to be used. What I hope you can see is going to be a waste of time is to go into something straight away like either a skills training approach or alternatively an approach which is about trying to get the client to experience and own their anger. Because in both of those instances, what you're going to get is either pretend compliance, or alternatively, you're just going to get overt amplified resistance. So that's that side of things. Now, let's move on to, and I'm sorry we're having to go through this so quickly, let's move on to the whole issue of anger suppression, which I didn't really touch on at all before. And what I'm going to try and do really over about 10 minutes really is to try and offer you out some alternative ways of thinking about anger suppression, and to give you a very, very basic protocol or set of guidelines about the way in which you might approach anger suppression problems that your clients might well have. So I want to start off with really, again, saying something which is deliberately designed to challenge really, but which I think is a sort of common underlying assumption, or it challenges a common underlying assumption that many of us have, and which we've either been sort of consciously trained to believe, or alternatively, we've just sort of picked it up as an attitude in our therapeutic work, which is the idea that anger suppression is bad. Now, what I want to suggest to you is that it isn't always bad. It is bad in some instances, but it isn't always bad. And in addition to that, which goes even a step further, is I'm going to argue that it's not always the answer to let it out. So that whole model, I mean, in fact, the very term anger suppression implies that this is something which is bottled up and needs to be expressed. Now, although this is the case in some instances, it's actually a lot more complicated than that. And you will either find that you hit a lot of resistance if you take that as a pure model, or alternatively, you may, in some instances, find that actually what you're doing with your client may, in some instances, be quite dangerous, in fact. So let me just sort of take you through 3 separate factors as I see them, which are important or should be important in our assessment of clients who come along with anger suppression problems. So we've got somebody, we're going to assume we have a client in front of us who it's crossing our minds that they have anger suppression problems. Now, what leads us to think that? Well, a number of things might lead us to think that. They may be somebody who appears to be extremely passive and generally speaking does not express negative views about anything aversive. That's one possibility. We might, and I think this is a much more common presentation for people with anger suppression problems, we might be working with people who my mother would have called, she wouldn't have called them angry, she would have said that they were bitter. And there's that sense that although these people are feeling angry, they don't directly express it. It sort of bubbles under the surface. If it is being expressed, it's being expressed indirectly. There may be a sort of a desynchrony between what they're doing with their body language and what is actually coming out of their mouth. You know, these are often people who say, well, no, of course I don't mind at all. you know, and that there's not a synchrony between, in a sense, what they're doing non-verbally and what they're saying. And then, of course, there's a third group of people who are maybe very passive and compliant 95% of the time, and then periodically explode. They may explode verbally, but they may explode physically as well, in a way which is disproportionate, really, to or very antisocial in terms of the way in which they express it. So as I say, there's three factors to think about in your assessment of folks like this. The first one is one which I personally think tends to get ignored the most, which is you need to be making some degree of assessment about whether this client is somebody who has a tendency to almost exclusively, selectively attend to perceived attack, injustice, or insult. In other words, they see themselves as being under attack, or being a victim, or being treated badly, near enough all the time, or certainly very frequently. And as a result of that, they have a perception of themselves as being almost continuously being treated badly, or being under attack by other people. And I'm going to come back to this in a minute, because this is it's a selective attention problem, and it's a perceptual problem. Can I say this is not to deny the presence of such injustice, unfairness, attack. It is simply to say that this person typically has a low threshold for perceiving it, and it tends to be the only thing that they tend to see around them. The second thing, and I think this, to be honest with you, is more about the relationship between anger and behavior, is where the individual has what I would describe as being an inflexible form of impulse control. Now, what do I mean by inflexible impulse control? Either they are very over-controlled, and this is certainly the most common problem for folks with anger suppression problems. They're stuck in a single gear, really, which is to always to control their emotions. Obviously, for some people with expression problems with anger, their difficulty is that they're often inflexible with regards to impulse control, in terms of always actually being under controlled with regards to their expression of their feelings. But in this context of anger suppression, these are folks who are over controlled. Now, why I think this is important to frame it in this way, to frame it as an inflexibility, is that I guess that all of us here know that there are certain circumstances where it is important for us to keep our mouth shut, where it's important for us to control how we actually feel. But I hope, to varying degrees, we are also able to make a judgment in terms of both when we do express our anger and the degree to which we express it as well. In other words, we're able to demonstrate some degree of flexibility with regards to our impulse control. And certainly for people with anger suppression problems, it's that inflexibility of always being over-controlled which tends to be the difficulty. And then finally, there's the whole issue, and I think this is probably, to be honest with you, the area that therapists have a tendency to concentrate on so much, almost exclusively, ignoring the other two areas, is the attitude that the client has towards anger. And certainly for a lot of people, not all, but for a lot of people with anger suppression problems, their difficulties lie with the fact that they have a very negative set of beliefs about anger and its expression. Most commonly, these have actually come from early message givers or early experiences, but they may have come from significant life events or significant circumstances later on in life, where they have had to keep their mouth shut, basically, to keep safe. And they developed an attitude which basically says to express anger is dangerous, or to express anger is a sign of badness, or whatever. So if you bear those three areas in mind, which is the threshold for perception of threat, injustice, and unfairness. Secondly, you bear in mind the issue about over control of impulsivity and it being inflexible. And thirdly, you take into consideration the attitude towards anger. Then that should give you some pointers with regards to which of the areas you should be concentrating on with a particular client that you're working with who has got anger suppression problems. So let me just take you through that. So if we've got somebody here who tends to selectively attend almost exclusively to threat, injustice, etc., then really what you need to be doing with them is to help them to identify what are basically non-confirming experiences. In other words, to get them to monitor, to selectively attend to things in their life and episodes and experiences in their life where they are not being treated unfairly, where they are not being degraded, where they are not being treated unjustly. And I can tell you now that everybody will have some of those experiences in their life. Now, this is not, can I emphasize, to deny the fact that injustice occurs, but it's simply to recognize that that is not the only experience that the person's having. Now, why is this important? Because whatever it is we selectively attend to tends to amplify. So that if I'm exclusively selectively attending to injustice, that is all I see. I feel I'm totally surrounded by it. I'm totally imprisoned by it. If I was to selectively attend, for instance, and to take note of the instances where I am treated just like anybody else, if I was to selectively attend to instances where people treat me reasonably, if I was to selectively attend to the people in my life who care for me, who have concern for me, then that helps to dilute the intensity of this. So this is not to deny injustice. It is more about recognizing that this is not the only experience I've got in my life. So that's one area for that part. The second part, which is all to do with inflexibility of impulse control. In brief, this is a fairly straightforward bit. This is skills training and practice. So the thing that has been used historically most commonly for this has obviously been assertiveness skills training. And that would be the broad route I would go down, although I would say I would go light on the detail of the skills training and I would go heavy on repeated practice with your client on this. The third area, which is about the attitude towards anger, is classic CBT country, to be honest with you. It's where our aim would be to use a variety of strategies, primarily in order to create a certain level of cognitive doubt for the client, in order to not eliminate, let alone reverse, their attitude towards anger. We don't want a client who thinks that anger is fantastic and that to show it anywhere is a great thing to do. But what we do need is we need a client who is willing to recognize that being angry on certain occasions is not a horrific thing to actually be. That there are some instances where it's more justifiable than others, and that although one wouldn't wish to be angry for large proportions of our life, if one is angry, even when it's not justified, in retrospect, it's not the end of the world. So any cognitive strategy really, which is designed to address that, I think is useful there. So folks, I know that is a very rapid run through and again, quite a lot of material there, but I hope it gives you some pointers. And I see we've got at least a few minutes here left. If there are any particular questions that you want to pick up on, I'll leave it to Julia if she wants to pick up on some or however she wishes to do that.
Thank you, Paul. I'll start with Hannah's question, because lots of people echoed it and asked to answer it. How do you work with anger expressed towards you as a therapist? For example, accused of not being helpful.
Okay. Well, my first starting point with this is to make sure, I hope, that I am sufficiently aware of my own belief system and that I don't hold on to it too tightly, which is actually the problem that a lot of our clients have. So, for instance, if I define myself as a therapist as someone who is a failure unless they help every single client that they work with, I'm going to have a problem. I'm going to feel rejected. I'm going to feel very bad. If I am someone who, as a therapist, has a belief that anger and violence are always very closely related, if I have a client who is angry, I'm going to find that very scary and difficult to deal with. So the first thing to say about this is that this may require work on ourselves in terms of our own belief system. Having said that, I think that, for me, there is a very clear cutoff point whereby there is certain behavior, which is different from emotion, but there's certain behavior which my client might express in a session which I would not see as being acceptable. Now, we haven't got really time to go into that, but obviously physical violence is the most obvious example of it. But there are some precursors to physical violence which I would not see as being acceptable in my client, and I would have a distinct and clear boundary on it. Standing up, for example, in the middle of a session or moving towards me would be an example of that. Pointing, for me, would be another example of that, simply because we know that they are common precursors to violent behavior. But again, I hope that gives some pointers. You need to make a decision really about whether this is about you and your beliefs as a therapist, and whether there's some work that needs to be done on that. And let's face it, we have some very interesting beliefs as therapists which take us in to the business that we're actually doing, or whether this is actually about an issue of risk assessment, really.
Thank you. Another question from, I copied them in. Yes, from Rashmi. Some people say that they are naturally angry. Is it true? And also some people say anger is genetic. Is it true?
Right. We've got no real evidence that anger is genetic. And there are rare instances where it's the case, but broadly speaking, no. We know that there are some major gender differences on violence. Maybe that's not going to be a surprise, but there are some major gender differences on violence. But if you're primarily seeing that as being testosterone-based, except again in extreme instances, that is not likely to be the case. It appears primarily to be socially defined. And there's a very interesting exception to that, which I think clearly emphasizes it or illustrates it very well, which is that we know that women on the whole tend to have a lower threshold for anger when their children are under threat. In some particular way, or they're perceived as being under threat, more so than men do. So broadly speaking, no, this is socially defined, even when there are gender differences, that's the case. Am I born angry? Well, that's a very interesting question. We know that by definition, babies are often having high levels of distress. That's just part of being a baby. And one of the things that happens developmentally to babies is they start being able to differentiate that distress and begin to label it differently. So, when they reach a certain age, typically about 4 to 5, they can begin to make a distinction, for instance, between things like anger and anxiety. But broadly speaking, it's just a sort of nebulous distress before them. That level of distress is partly influenced by parenting style, and particularly the basic nurturing, really, in early developmental history. And also we know that in some instances, physical illness, some of which can be, of course, be genetic, will also influence that. So there are some instances where that might be the case. I suspect that when people say that to you and they say, you know, I think it's genetic, what they actually mean is my father was a very angry man, and that's why I'm a very angry man, to which my reply would be, that's probably where you've learnt it from.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. A very brief question before we finish. I just wanted to mention one thing just to share. Lynn was asking about focus on working with children, especially anger at self. We probably need to approach one of our trainers on a child course to maybe do a specific children one.
It is a slightly, it's a slightly different issue, can I say, because of the fact that I mentioned earlier on, which is that anger problems in children are, first of all, have very different presentations and factors involved according to age. I mean, an obvious point to actually make here is that as you go down the age scale, you are more likely to find that cognitive factors and perceptions are less important. You're more likely to find that environment and parental behavior and also physical factors and physiological needs are much more likely to play a key role. As you go up the age scale, you'll tend to find that cognitive factors play more of a role in a way which is not as marked as they are in adults, but it's going in that direction. But you're quite right. It is a slightly different area and slightly more complicated. Yeah.
Well, we'll look into probably addressing it at some point.
Yeah.
And a very brief question, Irina asked it twice. Can anger be addictive? I think you know that your answer is yes. I know your answer.
Yeah, without a shadow of a doubt. And very, very quickly, can I just say why it's addictive? Can I just, it's particularly addictive because it frequently gives external positive reinforcement. That's the most obvious reason. In other words, you're more likely to get what you want when you're angry. People give you what you want and you learn that. And yes, it's addictive for that particular reason. There are other reasons as well. Sometimes people find it easier to get angry rather than feel something else. Sometimes people find it easier to get angry rather than feel the pain of grief, for instance. And so for that particular reason, it operates from a behavioral perspective as a strange negative reinforcer. It actually takes away the greater pain of the grief. You do have a physiological buzz from it. It's one of the, people actually don't seem to grasp this very often, about the fact that anger and losing temper is fun. Particularly where it's expressed in terms of violence. And if you think that sounds a really weird idea, you have never fully grasped the attraction of boxing, or you've never fully grasped the fact that fans get most excited about a football game when somebody kicks off. But yes, you get a physiological buzz from it too. So yes, it can be addictive.
Thank you. Thank you. We're up. Unfortunately, our time is up. And thank you for coming. Thank you for your kind words. We haven't discussed yet what we're doing next Thursday, but at the moment, next Thursday is still on the cards. We're not on holidays yet. So see you next Thursday. And thank you very much for coming. And see you again.
Thank you, folks. Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for all your lovely comments. Thank you.